Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Queensland Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research. Today's topic is Cultural Considerations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Families, presented by Samantha Wild. This webinar is live and interactive. You are encouraged to participate by posting questions to Samantha using the chat box which is located on the bottom left side of your screen, just to the right of the cogwheel. After typing out your question, hit Enter to submit. Questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. For technical assistance, please phone Redback Support at 1-800-733-416. I will now hand over to Samantha to begin.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the Redback webinar for Cultural Considerations in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Families. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land in which we meet today. For me, that's the Turrbal people, but I also want to pay my respects to the people across this country who might be phoning in or dialing in from anywhere in Queensland. Before we start, I'll talk a little bit about me and what I do and how I've ended up here today. So I run my own consultancy services called Awakening Cultural Ways, and I provide a range of services around cultural solutions for complex Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and mental health policy and planning and workforce development. So we've developed a story for working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. As we always do, we use stories to tell our ways. So the First Nation people are ancient knowledge holders of sacred wisdom and stories of this land. A long time ago there were no animals or people, and the land was barren and silent. From one generation to another, Dreamtime stories tell of the magnificent creation of animals, people, and the land. One glorious day, a mythical rainbow serpent awoke from her deep sleep to travel across the nations to create land, seas, and country. This is how she became known as the Mother of Life. The serpent created ancient laws and stories for the people to abide by, and she fiercely avowed harmony and justice. One day the rainbow serpent looked across the nations to realise the glory of her creation, and she vanished into the dreaming. It's pretty funny, you can hear my family totem outside the crow. We'll be having a good old yarn while I'm talking today as well. So what we believe is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the holders of solutions and can design cultural practice frameworks for working in local communities but across more national programs as well. So we call for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be leaders in the development of these solutions, which are evidence-based and culturally grounded. So here's a photo of me when I graduated from the Indigenous Trauma and Recovery Program with Auntie Judy Atkinson and a range of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students from across Australia. And this, I guess, gave the foundation to the work that I've been doing around domestic and family violence and the interconnections to trauma and intergenerational trauma. So everything that I do with our community is generational. Everything that I do is a legacy for the next generation. So I'm always very mindful about my actions and the footprints that I'm leaving for the next generation. So here's a picture of my beautiful daughter and my beautiful son, who I always hold in my heart when I'm talking about very sensitive issues. And I'm reminded how important our families are. So prior to colonisation, you should all have seen this amazing map of Aboriginal Australia and the diversity of geographical locations and the different mobs that lived across this country. So I guess this is really important in talking today, is that I will bring my knowledge and my cultural knowledge into the discussions that we have. I'm sure that we can make these slides available for you, Travis, after this webinar is completed. So while I bring my knowledge and my cultural knowledge, I pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and acknowledge that there is no one simple solution and that local contexts are different. But I fiercely vow to uphold what our elders hold as cultural practice across many nations. So I'm a Waka Waka woman, and you can see my mob. I come at the top of the Waka Waka people, and I'm a ginger skin group. So we're close to the Goring mob, and I'm very blessed to have been raised on Butchulla country in Hervey Bay. So that gives you a bit of an understanding of who I am, and hopefully if you've got any questions about that later on, we can talk about that as well. So there's 3 learning objectives from the PowerPoint today. I'm hoping to increase awareness of the scale and severity of problems of violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. We're going to look at some of the underlying causes and drivers of domestic and family violence in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And then we're going to review some different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander best practice frameworks around prevention. So I'm sure you're all here and joined because you know that violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander is increasing in severity and complexity. But just to rehash for those that may not know, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are 3 times the rate of non-Indigenous to experience violence, which equals to about 3 in 5 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who experience physical and sexual violence. So they're 11 times more likely to die due to assault than non-Indigenous women, and they're 32 times the rate of hospitalisation. So that's physical injuries resulting from violence, and the frequency is more severe for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So 32 times the non-Indigenous women, and 3 times the rate for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men. We all know that there's a significant health disadvantage and disparity between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and non-Indigenous Australians. Intimate partner violence contributes to 10.9% of the burden of disease for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women aged 18 to 44. So more than other health risk factors, including alcohol and tobacco use, or being overweight and obese. So this contributes to women's burden of disease 6.2 times higher than non-Indigenous women. I think what's really important as we hold women central to all of our discussions when we're talking about family violence, we need to remember too that our children are at greater risk. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children have a higher risk to exposure of family violence than non-Indigenous children, with 2/3 of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander adults experiencing violence sharing their household with children. So what's really important in this context, and I'll talk a bit about later on, is that family violence is the leading reason for the high numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children being removed from their families. So this really just tells us that domestic and family violence is disproportionate. It's much higher and severe for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. Our women and children are vulnerable, and that violence is complex. So we must address the drivers of this violence and look at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families who are living with the legacy of colonisation and ongoing racism, which is what we're going to talk a bit about very soon. Flicking through the slides. So I guess what's really important is when we do talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, there are a lot of misconceptions around violence and violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. And that really takes away from the focus of the deeper issues that need our attention. So I'm going to challenge these so that we can look at our attention and efforts at the drivers of violence. So violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women is not a part of traditional culture. When violence occurred prior to colonisation, it was really regulated and controlled and had no kind of resemblance to the family violence that we see in our communities today. In fact, many aspects of traditional culture and law respected and protected our women. So as custodians of an Aboriginal culture surviving 60,000 years, what we have had and would have had over many generations was successfully managed interpersonal family and community relationships. And that really depended on adherence to strict cultural law, which did articulate our relationships and our connections to each other. So when we see this political debate and media reporting that imply that violence is a part of our culture, we need to stand firm and remind people that violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women is perpetrated by men from many different cultures. It's not only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men. So anecdotal evidence talks about non-Indigenous men make up a proportion of the perpetrators who do, in fact, harm Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. So the data's a little bit grey, but what it does show is that it's more likely to be a non-Indigenous man when we are looking at cities, and the further remote you go, the more higher the chances of it being a non-Indigenous male. So this isn't just an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issue, this is an Australian issue. So we need to think more broadly about our perpetrators and what they look like as well. So alcohol is a contributing factor for violence, but it is not the cause. Across Australia, we know for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, the frequency and severity of violence is connected to or can be triggered by the use of alcohol. But where there is a correlation between alcohol and violence, in some Aboriginal communities, it needs to be understood around the context of those communities. Colonization had introduced alcohol, so prior to colonization there wasn't so many high rates of harmful use of alcohol in the context of coping mechanisms and self-medicating behaviour. So this means that what we need to do is look at the harmful alcohol use and the underlying reasons for using alcohol. We also need to understand the use of alcohol in the social norms and practices, which does not condone violence against women, and the violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women needs to look at drinking cultures amongst all groups of men, and emphasise that aggression and disrespect towards women is not a part of culture. So I'll keep going if we're happy with that. Looking at some of the causes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities particularly, we see a lot of frustration and stress which can lead to violence in any community, but particularly around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community stresses. We see the loss of land and traditional culture, and we have seen in some of the successful programs implemented in Australia that cultural practices have lessened interpersonal violence in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. We've seen the breakdown of community kinships systems and Aboriginal law, which is why we need to remind people that this was not a traditional custom or practice, that violence was never tolerated in the family. We've seen a lack of respect within families from younger generations toward elders, and I guess that's really important as well when we do talk about family violence, because of our strong kinship systems which are much broader than non-Indigenous family units. We do see a whole range of victims and perpetrators, not only intimate partners, but we're talking parents, siblings, aunties, grandparents, carers, a whole range of people within our social networks can be perpetrating violence. We've seen the loss of identity, and I'll talk more about that as we go through this today. And obviously, racism and stigma and discrimination are ongoing causes of stress and frustration with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. So when we look at the principles of prevention of family violence, there's been a lot of emerging work in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander space, which are quite consistent in what they're recommending around strategies for prevention. So what's most important and a key factor is using decolonisation frameworks which promote and empower self-determination, community ownership and leadership. This also includes cultural safety and looking at embedding cultural healing practices as well as trauma-informed practice. And whenever we do this work, as you would all know, we need to make sure that we are protecting our practitioners as well through self-care. A holistic approach using social and emotional wellbeing is recommended, so having a more broader understanding for strengthening culture and identity. And as always, using a strength-based approach and strengthening community approaches in responding to violence. And as I mentioned before, because of the diversity of our communities, we need to be able to look at adapting to different communities, demographics and geographic contexts. What's really important is addressing the intersectional discrimination that's experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women, and how we can bring non-Indigenous organisations who are working as allied with us in culturally safe ways. So hopefully, using these principles, we can start looking at innovative responses and initiatives supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander programs. What we have seen predominantly in the past is the culturation of Western violence prevention programs with a little bit of an Indigenous spin on their mainstream programs or services. I guess what these principles are telling us are that we need to revision programs and really have culture and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of healing and working central to the development of these programs. All right. So when we look at social and emotional well-being, I think it's this will become consistent throughout most of what I'm talking about today. Social and emotional well-being is a framework that's been established by a senior Indigenous psychologist which really looks at the holistic well-being of individuals but can be applied more broadly at a family and community level. I'm going to get my little pointer on the slides here. So this section in the middle, social and emotional well-being, when we're looking at an individual level, can really be the identity. So this is what makes us who we are and what makes us work and engage in the world in the ways that we do. So it is all connected to these 8 different domain areas. So if we look at the connection to spirituality and ancestors as a strength, which builds our connection to our knowledge and our history, our connection to our body, so our physical health, but also our illness and disabilities contribute to our connections to body. Our connection to our mind is how we're thinking and how we're feeling, and how that might engage with how we are in the world, so how well we sleep, how well we function. Our connection to family is really important because of our kinship systems. We do have extended family that we need to care and support for, and they are a source of strength, and it's also our responsibility to protect our family. Our connection to community means that we are working with and alongside our community in its entirety, whether it be elders, community organisations, attending cultural events, or participating in ceremonies like sorrow business or grief ceremonies. And then we have connection to culture, which can include, is different for everyone, but it might be visiting country, going back to family and community. It might be practicing traditional song or dance. It might be passing on knowledge to the next generation and engaging in that connection to who we are. And then what's really important and has actually been identified in some of the key family violence documents is our connection to land and country, which is really important for our well-being, but also our spiritual connections, our connection to our body and our mind. It's almost our connection to land could go around all of these other circles as it contributes in a positive way to our well-being. So that's a really quick overview of social and emotional well-being. On any day we can have really strong connections, or we might have weak connections which are impacting who we are and how we're feeling. But there often are these external factors which influence our well-being. So it can be our interactions and our experiences throughout the day, which could be positive interactions, or it could be negative experiences. So that's where we see stigma and racism and discrimination. There might be historical determinants, such as living on country, which might be very remote, which limits our access to services. It might be cultural determinants, which which impact whether we are successful or not successful in our engagement for the day. And then there's always social determinants and social determinants of health, which include access to housing, employment, services and basic human needs. So all of those interactions then interplay on whether we are feeling very positive or not so positive. And social emotional wellbeing can be used as an assessment, it can be used as case management tool. So I've done some thinking around traditional social emotional wellbeing and what that looked like for our people, and I've designed sort of my knowledge into a chart which looks at those 8 domains, and then the traditional interactions with spirituality, our body, our mind, our family, community, culture and land. And what you begin to see is that in fact everything that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people did in a traditional context was governed by our cultural practices and our cultural beliefs, which ensured for and maintained a healthy society and healthy families. So what we see today is that we have lost a lot of those connections and knowledge, and what we see are high rates of grief and loss and family violence and removal of children, anger, dysfunction, chaos and suicide. There's food insecurity and overcrowding, cultural isolation, geographical isolation, poor education and unemployment. There's generational poverty, there's welfare dependency, and in some communities income management. And we see the ongoing cycle of oppression, racism and discrimination, which also impacts on institutional racism and intergenerational trauma. And for our younger kids, we're seeing very high rates of juvenile justice and incarceration, and this ongoing political debate by our politicians and our governments, while we're still seeing deaths in custody. So what we do need to consider, as I figure out how to change the slide, is that colonisation sets the underlying context for family violence in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And I guess this is the significant difference between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and non-Indigenous and mainstream responses. So there are 3 intersecting drivers which there is no one cause, it's very complex, and these can really be understood by looking at the impacts of ongoing colonisation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and then looking at the ongoing impacts of colonisation for non-Indigenous people in society, and then the gendered factors for both gender and inequality in a general sense, and then specific gender drivers of violence, which are inherited in the legacy of colonisation. So these drivers have multiple aspects, and they overlap and intersect with each other in very complex ways and in different contexts. So this is just a way to understand the disproportionate levels of family violence in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities using a context that is historical, and the continued colonial and systemic violence that we're experiencing in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So as I said, these intersections between the multiple drivers result in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women experiencing disproportionate levels of violence with severe and complex impacts. So when we look at the ongoing impacts of colonisation in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, this might, some examples of this include intergenerational trauma and collective trauma, systemic oppression, disempowerment and racism, destruction and disruption of traditional culture, family, kinship and community relationships, and cultural norms of violence, personal experiences and exposure to violence, and the condoning of violence within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. What's really important to remember is that the systemic attacks on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander social and emotional wellbeing, kinship structures, cultural practices, language and spirituality are a key factor that's recognised around the erosion of spiritual wellbeing and physical wellbeing. So are a contributor to the high levels of violence we see for women and children. When we look at the ongoing impacts of colonisation in non-Indigenous society, some examples include racialised structural inequalities of power, entrenched racism and social norms, attitudes and practices, the perpetration of racist violence, and the condoning of and insufficient accountability for violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And when I think of this example, I guess what comes to my mind is Miss Dew, who passed away in 2014, and while she had every opportunity for the system to respond to her distress and her poor health, unfortunately, because of those racialised structures and people's misconceptions of an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander woman, she died in custody as a result of injuries caused by domestic violence. All right. So when we look at gendered factors, more broadly, what we see is the condoning of violence against women. We see perpetrators' control of decision-making and limits to women's independence, and a stereotype construction of masculinity and femininity. I think it's different in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities because there is a different gender role around men's business and women's business, which can sometimes be misconstrued, but it is definitely something that impacts our well-being and who we are. So additional drivers specific for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people looks at the destruction or disruption of traditional culture, family and kinship, particularly around family relationships and cultural norms about violence. We see personal experience and exposure to violence, and as I said earlier on in the presentation, all of this work that we do with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities is multi-generational, and recognising that perpetrators today may have been a victim as a child, so that ongoing kind of exposure to violence is multi-generational. What we see is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are often invisible women, and they only become apparent to the system when they are in crisis or a client or require support. We see the condoning of and poor accountability for violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. So what we're seeing in the domestic and family violence sector at the moment for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women is really a call for a shift in the paradigm around the processes of community healing, which are grounded in Indigenous knowledge. So what we need to think is moving away from the simple criminal justice model and look at collective processes that can be embedded from local knowledge holders. And it really says that the coercive control and male power as an explanation for violence against women in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities really then does devalue or misses out on the interpersonal violence such as the couple fighting and looking at the reflection of chaotic lifestyles, alcohol abuse and trauma. So non-Indigenous crisis interventions are really important for our immediate safety for our women and children. But what we need to look at now is a long-term work required to prevent family violence and to heal the consequences that of the legacy we're living today. So for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, this can be part of the solution. So culture really is seen as a protective factor. It is part of the healing model that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are using for trauma-informed programs. So what we see is that a strong cultural identity is fundamental to strong mental health, social and emotional well-being, and those cultural connections to our communities. They provide a unique protective factor, and we've seen some fantastic results around the interventions for reduction of intimate personal violence. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have strong attachment to culture have a better assessed health and mental health. And what we see is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and families prioritise their cultural knowledge equal to mainstream education. So when we're looking at interventions for children and young children, supporting them to be able to live between the two worlds. What's really interesting is in the evidence around culture is that the causal factors which increase resiliency through enculturation are not really defined in the literature. So when we go on and start to explore identity and thinking about the social emotional wellbeing model and identity as a central part within our wellbeing, identity really gives Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people ownership and responsibility around cultural obligations and their role within the broader community and their family. It strengthens their wellbeing and their maintenance of their identity. And this notion of multi-generational, that this always was and always will be, so a sustenance and a reassurance that we are contributing positive outcomes for the future. It's the formation of cultural safety through strict cultural protocols and practices. And again, it's anything that's outside of the society norms can sometimes be perceived as unsafe practices. And I guess when we look at that from a domestic violence, we really need to think about how do we recreate those traditional cultural beliefs around violence and create new social norms around protection and survival of families. Identity provides leadership to inform then Western frameworks of cultural responsibilities and really looking at how to grow our local leadership to be able to inform program development. We see that cultural and identity programs build a strong collective pride and self-determination and empowerment within groups. So cultural identity creates safety and belonging, helps re-establish the collective kinship and family systems that we often see break down. It is driven by indigeneity, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of being, knowing and holding spaces which allow for a really holistic individual and collective wellbeing. It's generational responsibilities to be able to navigate and share cultural systems. So the transference of cultural knowledge is really important to help maintain cultural identity. But this all requires access to culture and heritage and cultural expression. What we see in a lot of families is that when they have experienced a significant disconnection from their culture, they are waiting for endorsement by society and institutions to allow them to continue to connect to and practice culture. This helps to then create a balance and harmony of living in the two worlds. So if we could think back to the slide with all the words around some of the issues that we're confronting in our communities today, what we need to do is find the balance to be able to reconnect those strong healing methodologies within our most vulnerable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So, a great paper was released, I think it was last year, with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Healing Foundation and the White Ribbon, where they were looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander family violence prevention for boys and men. And they came up with this kind of framework around potentially the cultural determinants of health that could help facilitate trauma recovery using these 4 pillars. So we've got the most important is creating safe spaces and healing places that help identify safe people within communities. So safety is always the first priority. Identity, so as I've just described, building that strong cultural connection to identity by reconnecting to our cultural values and practices. Then reconnection, so looking at rebuilding our relational support systems with our family and community and services that can help support us. And then trauma awareness. So what's really important is our community learning more broadly about the impacts of trauma, not only on our minds and our bodies and our spirits, but also on our families, so that we can help find that path to healing and we can ensure that we contribute to breaking the cycle of intergenerational trauma. So this is also really important with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and boys and women and girls, and looking at community awareness around what is violence and what is family violence, and how to identify healthy relationships and family relationships. So What's really important in this space is that we honour our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, and it was an amazing celebration this year to have NAIDOC theme being Because of Her We Can, and really looking at how we can support all our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, but those 3 and 5 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who have experienced violence in their life, and looking at how we can respect and support and promote their rights as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. So as I discussed before in the principles, what we need to do is look at self-determination and how we can improve Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women's ability to make choices and decisions about their lives and relationships to support positive decision making. It's about promoting the equality by challenging sexist and racist attitudes towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, and again strengthening the positive, equal and respectful relationships between men, women and girls and boys. So what we have seen is that at some frontline services there can be a lack of empathy for our victims who don't really want to act in the ideal way a domestic violence victim should behave. And so we do see that then creates a barrier for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. And I guess what I'm talking about today is thinking more broadly about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women's needs, and more broadly around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and their role to play in prevention of family violence. So I wanted to give you all, I'm sure you're busting to know how to fix it, so I guess some really important tips around responding to disclosure. Most importantly, name it. Family and domestic violence is what it is, and we need to be more confident in being able to identify it and talk about it. So name violence for what it is. Ensure that safety comes first. I guess for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in these situations, they will come to you when they do need help because they can maintain their safety, and they have done so for some time before they've disclosed. If they are coming to you, it's because they trust you. And what we know that women want to hear is that violence is never acceptable. So reaffirm that is really important for our women. As much as possible, be culturally aware, and hopefully you've got some hints and tips from me yarning today. But if you can't be culturally aware or you don't know if there are things that you don't know, I would highly recommend that you work with local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders to be able to identify any skill sets that your service might need. Acknowledge that family violence is not an aspect of traditional Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. I think we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live by that model of social and emotional wellbeing, and we do really want to continue the aspects of culture that we do have. So it is really important to recognise and reaffirm that this is not our cultural way, and it never was, and it is something that we've seen a dramatic increase over many years following colonisation. So be aware that the crime has both a victim and a perpetrator and can be multi-generational. Always use sensitivity and ethical considerations when sharing a survivor story. So, for example, it might feel like a natural instinct to talk to an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander practitioner about an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander woman. I would not be sharing any survivor stories unless you have the explicit permission from the woman to do so, and just be really considerate around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and our confidentiality, because it's a very small community wherever we are, even if we're in the big cities. Sensitive issues such as family violence are something that we often don't want to be shared without our permission. So family violence is greatly underreported, particularly amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, and all I can assume is that family violence is a major contributor to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children being removed from their families. See you later, Charmaine. Thank you for coming. I'm sorry I don't know where the camera is very well. See ya. So I think what we need to remember is when we do start going through the legal system and reporting crimes of family violence, that often Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women will disengage if they're not fully aware of the repercussions that it might have on our family and our community. And in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community context, what's very different to mainstream communities is that the majority of the Western world live through an individualistic, I wish I could draw this for you, an individualistic kind of society where number one is me, and number two is my direct family, and number three is our community. Whereas Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and a lot of Eastern communities live by what we call a collective model, where we prioritise our community first and then our family second, and our own immediate needs often come last. So when we are looking at reporting of or the repercussions of reporting family violence and what that might mean for my family and the removal of children, or the broader for my community and the shame that that brings upon them, it might then mean that I will take a lot more risk and take a lot more pain to ensure that my family and community are protected. So that's really different around the cultural context and the consideration when working in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Sorry, I got lost yarning there. I'll keep going. I think what's really important as well is to talk to, if women do disclose to you, they've come to you because they do trust you. So it's important to create that safe and respectful and empowering space. Sometimes that may not be in four walls. Sometimes that might be wherever the woman feels safe. So working to ensure that you are able to provide a safe space for her. Also looking at, as I've already mentioned, confidentiality and reporting responsibilities. Be upfront about confidentiality and when you will be breaking confidentiality. And if you are to make any reports, what does that look like? What support will you provide to the woman and her family? Always use non-direct body language in questioning. When women, some women prefer to not have contact and prefer to not even face each other. So looking at other ways to be able to have more subtle communication styles. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people value silence. So as I mentioned before, sometimes when you ask a question, an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person is responding, they'll often be thinking about their cultural obligations and how they can respond without breaking their obligations. So allow time for silence and contemplation and feel comfortable with that silence. Always reinforce Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women's strengths, their culture and their resilience to violence. So helping to find in that social emotional wellbeing any strengths that women identify to help build up their sense of self-esteem and identity and re-establish that sense of independence. Enable re-empowerment. Everyone's perception of empowerment is different, so allowing women to identify what empowerment means for them and give them support to be able to work towards re-empowerment. What I would recommend is if you have a multidisciplinary team and you're working in a complex case with significant disclosure, definitely work towards establishing a social emotional wellbeing team or an interagency response. So with permission of the family that you're working with, offer holistic wraparound support, providing the most support with the least amount of people. Intervene in and respond to violence, ensuring that safety, legal, physical, financial, social, emotional supports are available. So a more broader, comprehensive response. All right. As I mentioned the paradigm shift before, what we are hearing very loudly from our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities is that we want to work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men, that our men are part of the solution. So we need to recognise, promote and support the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men in the prevention of violence in our communities. There is a really important positive role for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men to be working with, and even in some cases leading their own healing programs and working with men and boys to create change. What we do know is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men are not accessing services that could be be able to support their risk factors. I mean, there's been a whole range of services around women's health and men's health, but there's not been very inclusive around men's perception of wellbeing, and are often staffed by people who hold negative attitudes and stereotypes about our men. So looking at how to expand those opportunities. So we want to challenge the attitudes that normalise violence and always hold men accountable for their actions, not only to themselves and to each other, but to their customary law, their families and their communities. We want to acknowledge the damaging and traumatic impacts of colonisation on men, but while also maintaining that there's never an excuse for violence. So we want to look at providing opportunities for transformation through a range of cultural and therapeutic healing practices, both for group activities and individual counselling. It's interesting because the only people who understand Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men. And so what we are seeing is in this paradigm shift is a collective unity around working together to be able to identify the real core issues and how we can work together to be a part of the solution. All right. That was a video I'm cutting out. So when we look at addressing the legacies of colonisation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, so this is one of the core areas that we talked about in the intersections earlier on, consider healing the impacts of intergenerational trauma through strengthening culture and identity, and strengthen the support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, both women and girls, men and boys, and children and young people, and constantly challenge the condoning of violence in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. I don't really like the word condoning, but it's kind of what is happening. So I think there's a complacency or a normalisation of violence in our communities, and sometimes we just don't know what we don't know. When we're looking at addressing the legacies of colonisation for non-Indigenous society, we want to challenge and prevent all forms of racism, the indifference and the ignorance and the disrespect towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and cultures. We want to address the racialised power and inequalities and amend the discriminatory policies and practices. And we want to constantly challenge the condoning of violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Looking at addressing the gender drivers of violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, we want to look at implementing intersectional approaches to preventing violence across the whole Australian population. Again, challenging the violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, but really by challenging those racist and sexist attitudes and social norms that we see. We want to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women's participation in leadership and decision making. Constantly challenging those gender stereotypes and the impact of colonisation on men's and women's roles, the relationships and identities. We want to strengthen the positive, equal and respectful relationships between men, women, girls and boys, and engage both Indigenous and non-Indigenous men to challenge the harmful and violent supporting our ideas about masculinity and relationships. So it's 10:53 and I have flown through those slides. Has anyone got any questions? Because we've got a few minutes before we wrap it up. Yeah. So I guess you're exactly right. Travis has just said that lots of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are victims contact services during crisis, but then don't follow up with protection orders or charges. I guess, as I mentioned earlier on, we want to shift away from looking at the legal responses. I guess what we do know is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women want to go through different pathways to support healing. So that might mean, I'm trying to think of a really good example. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women need to be safe and they need to be protected. And in crisis, they do contact the police to ensure their safety. But when we look at the high rates of incarceration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men, who can often be a primary provider, it more so has more damaging effects on the family and the community if there's incarceration. So they won't follow through with the legal aspects if that's something that will have negative impacts beyond her as an individual. So we need to look at different ways, and whether that's through education and capacity building or longer term strategies to responding to crisis. Does that answer your question a little bit, Travis? I hope so. Has anyone else got a question? If anyone does have a question, my contact details are on the slide. Feel free to send me an email or give me a call. Yeah, absolutely, Sariogo. There is a massive report that's been done and they have absolutely looked at community consultations across the nation, and as a first they've included the voices of sister girls from the Northern Territory and really looked at what violence, how it presents differently for our LGBTI community, and prioritised solutions designed by the LGBTI Aboriginal and Torres Strait community. And I'd be more than happy to include that in the future. I think it's really important that we do look at the intersections more broadly for the high rates of family violence. Thanks, Andrew. Thank you, everyone. We'll get a copy of the slides out as well. Advertising and recruiting for Aboriginal and Torres Strait positions. It can be very hard to find Aboriginal and Torres Strait people who have the skill set and the passion to be able to do this work without burning themselves out. Because we do often put our community above our own needs, we can often, rather than doing a lot of self-care, we can really take on a lot of those trauma stories that we're exposed to in the domestic and family violence sector. But I would highly recommend, if you're going to recruit, to go through the Koori Mail, K-O-O-R-I, which is a paper, an Aboriginal newspaper, but they also promote it online. And so I'd use the Koori Mail. I think that would be the predominant. Cultural education appears to be a huge part in the moving forward towards prevention. What would you say the barriers are to this? Koori, I'll write it in here. I guess what's really hard is that, well, I can talk to you quite confidently around cultural considerations in this space. It can often be because of the stigma and the underlying stereotypes. I, as an Aboriginal woman sitting at a table with predominantly non-Indigenous people or men, will often not have my values heard. And I guess what we've seen in the research around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander domestic and family violence is that people are not hearing our stories, and people are not hearing what it is that we have as cultural solutions. And so we need to just slowly work on breaking down negative stereotypes in our own world and in our services and in our organisations. And because when we can start to really value that knowledge and expertise, I think we can start looking at innovative models of practice. So cultural education is really important, but more specifically around domestic and family violence and how that presents in the service as well. So we've got like a minute left. If anyone has any questions, now's the time. I just want to say thank you to everyone for logging on. I really appreciate that you've taken the time today, and I hope that it has contributed to your work in some way or another, and we can all work together to reduce violence in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Thank you all. I think that's...
We would like to thank Samantha for her presentation, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. We ask that you now take a moment to complete a short survey that has appeared on your screen. Please ensure you hit the orange submit button once you have completed all questions. We thank you in advance for your feedback, wish you a pleasant afternoon, and hope to see you at another Queensland Centre for Domestic and Family Violence Research webinar soon.